Hello and welcome back to this three-part series introducing you to the StoryGrid universe and methodology. We're talking about how to tell a story that readers love. In fact, we want to teach you how to write a story that readers will love so much they tell all of their friends. So we've already gone over a lot in the first two lessons, so let's just review that before we jump into today's lesson. First of all, you already know what makes a great story. You know this intuitively. You can tell at the end of reading a book, watching a movie, listening to a radio play, whether or not the story worked. And so what we're trying to do is take that intuition you already have, to take that deep understanding of what a great story is and teach you how to create that yourself. And we don't want this to be a random process where you're just kind of wandering around in a wilderness, hoping one day you'll stumble upon telling a great story. We want to teach you systematically how to do that. And that's what StoryGrid is all about. And the first thing we looked at is that stories are about change. They're about change happening in the characters' lives from the beginning to the end of the story. And we introduce you to this idea of genre and how genre walks you through what these changes are. And we looked at that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those universal needs and values that we have as humans, and how stories are about change that happens in those values. And we looked at this 5-leaf genre clover and how genre is looking at reality, style, structure, time, and especially that content genre. That's how we looked at those values that are changing. And then we asked the question, how do you know when you've had change in a story? How do you ensure that when you're writing, you put the correct change in your story? Well, that's where in the second lesson, we dove into the 5 commandments of storytelling. We talked about these 5 commandments are the way to ensure you're creating change at every level of your story, from the whole manuscript down to the scene and the beats. And we even looked at some of those. We looked at Wizard of Oz, The Hobbit, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and Pride and Prejudice. And those 5 commandments, again, just as a quick review, are the inciting incident, the turning point progressive complication, the crisis, the climax, and the resolution. And we talked about how, again, that's a big jump to start looking at a full story all the way down to the scene. And so I promised in this lesson, we're going to look at that scene level, because the truth about this is, if you plan out a perfect full story, right, you get the right macro elements in there, you know all the acts and you know what's going to happen in the third quadrant and all of this kind of stuff, but yet you can't consistently write great scenes that are compelling and exciting for readers that keep them turning pages, then it doesn't matter if your story works or not, because the reader's never going to get there. So we think the first thing writers should be looking at is how to keep readers reading. How do you keep readers so engaged in the story you're telling, they keep turning pages? We want them to get through a scene and can't wait to read the next one. So we have a lot to say about this as StoryGrid. But today I'm just going to introduce you to 3 different ideas that we use here at StoryGrid to teach writers how to write compelling, exciting scenes. And I love this stuff because all of this has been life-changing for me, but especially what I'm going to show you today has just revolutionized my writing over the last couple of years and made me such a better writer. And so I can't wait to share this with you. So this is what we call how to keep readers reading. The goal of this is to keep people just reading through your scenes, where when a reader starts reading your writing, they can't stop. They have to keep reading. So again, I just want to point out, I want to go back to that first lesson and point out that everything that we teach in this training is based on Sean Coyne's 30 years of experience as a writer and an editor. And this is also based on what we've seen at StoryGrid Publishing. When we would get manuscript submissions, we would see a lot of this stuff missing on that line-by-line, scene-by-scene writing. And so we wanted a way to systematically teach writers how to write better scenes. And so this is just 3 of the things that we use to teach that here at StoryGrid. So the first one is how to get your readers to care. How do we get your readers to connect to your protagonists and actually care what happens to them? This is really important. If the readers don't care about the protagonist and what happens to them, then they're not going to keep reading. They're not going to want to know what happens next. So how do we do that? The second thing is how to get your reader to connect. How to get extremely clear on who you are telling the story to so the reader will connect to your writing. So we want them to care about the protagonist, and then we want them to connect into your writing so that it's just flowing right into their brain and they're not missing anything and they always want to know what happens next. And finally, how do we get your reader engaged? How do we make sure that they don't become bored with the writing? How do we make sure they don't get distracted? How do we make sure that what we put in the story is what needs to be there and we cut everything else out that's irrelevant, that would distract or bore our reader? Again, this is all about creating exciting, compelling writing. So let's jump into that first one, how to get your readers to care. So this is going to get a little technical, okay? So when we get all the way down to the beat level of writing, and we're looking at what's happening on that line-by-line writing, it's all about input-output. And another way to think about this is we're going to have something happen to your protagonist and then they're going to react. So that something's going to input into them and then something is going to happen as a result. Input, output, input, output. Just think about this for now and then we're going to get into specifics in just a moment. And one of the mistakes we see is that we put the protagonist in the inputter role, that they're the ones actually causing the change and the output is happening to somebody else or something else. But if we go all the way back to the 5 commandments of storytelling, you can see that the protagonist is the one who has their life knocked out of balance, right? Some form of chaos comes in and knocks their life out of balance. If it wasn't for that, they would just keep living their life as normal. And so as you see there, something comes in, inputs into their life, this ball of chaos, and then something has to output. They react to that ball of chaos, right? So input, output, input, output. And what we're saying is the protagonist has to be the outputter. They have to be responding to what's happening. They cannot be the inputter. They have to be the outputter. Again, this can get really technical. Maybe I'm not making a lot of sense with this input-output thing, so I'd rather just jump straight into an example. Okay, so let's pull a scene from Pride and Prejudice. All right, so here's a scene from Pride and Prejudice. I'm just going to read it really quick, and then we're going to dissect it a little bit. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and 4 to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately, that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. What is his name? Okay, so this is the very first scene of Pride and Prejudice, and the protagonist of this scene is Mr. Bennet, because he is the one whose life is being knocked out of order. He's just trying to live his life as he's always lived his life, just move his way through his life, trying not to be bothered. And this ball of chaos comes in, which is this house being let in Netherfield. And so I just want to show you the inputs and the outputs. So again, think about the inciting incident here. Mr. Bennet would just keep on living his life as normal, if not for what happens first. So his wife says, "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" That's the input. And so now Mr. Bennet has to respond to that. He has to react to what just happened to him. And so he replied that he had not. So then she inputs again, and then he outputs again, and then she inputs again, and he outputs again. Then she does a nice long input, then he outputs again. And you see this happen over and over and over. And what you're seeing is that Mr. Bennet is the one outputting. He's the one reacting to what's happening to him. And so the input output, you have to think about who is the protagonist of your scene, who is the one who is the inciting incident is happening to, who is the one the turning point happens to, and who is the one that is forced to make a decision. And you see, if you keep reading, the crisis of this is he has to make a decision about what to do with this guy moving into his neighborhood. And so once you understand that, you see, okay, if I put my protagonist in the outputter role, then the reader is automatically going to connect with them because they're going to be reacting to what's happening too. Okay, so let's look at another one. So here's a passage from the first scene of The Hobbit. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. He had a tall pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, a silver scarf over which a white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. "Good morning," said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining and the grass was very green. But Gandalf looked at him from under long bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want not, or that you feel good this morning, or that it is morning to be good on?" "All of them at once," said Bilbo, "and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors into the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry. We have all the day before us." Then Bilbo sat down on his seat by his door, crossed his legs, and blew out a beautiful gray ring of smoke that sailed up into the air without breaking and floated away over the hill. So again, if we just break this up into input and output, Bilbo is just sitting there minding his own business when this old man comes along. And because this old man comes along, Bilbo says, "Good morning." Now, you have to see here, Bilbo would not have said good morning if this old man wouldn't have come along. If there was no old man walking along, he would have just sat there smoking his pipe. His life would not have changed at all. But because of the input of the old man coming in, the protagonist has to respond and say good morning. And then Gandalf responds. He says a bunch of stuff to Bilbo, and then Bilbo responds, and that's his output. So again, you see that the outputter, the protagonist, is always the outputter of the scene. You have to make your protagonist the outputter. This is how you get your reader to care about your protagonist. Because, again, going back to the 5 commandments, the inciting incident is the thing that comes into the protagonist's life and knocks their life off balance. We as a reader automatically connect with the person that's put in a situation that they weren't expecting. We start thinking, what would I do in that situation? I wonder what's going to happen next to them. And so if you want your reader to connect to your protagonist, you need to make them the outputter. You need to make them the one reacting to things in their environment. They can't be the one causing the change. They have to be reacting to the change. So when we talk about how to keep readers reading, that first thing we're looking at is how to get your readers to care. And we have to make sure the protagonist is always the outputter. They are the one reacting. So now let's look at that second thing, how to get your reader to connect. How do we get extremely clear about who you are telling your story to so the reader will connect to your writing? All right. So now I want to introduce you to this idea of Sam. Who is Sam? Well, Sam is the person that's sitting in place of your protagonist, and we think of them as the single audience member. So when we start talking about how to get your reader to connect to your writing, to keep reading, and we're talking about how they're connecting to their protagonist, the reason they're connecting to your protagonist is because they're dealing with their own problem. So this is what we call the narrative device at StoryGrid. And we, again, are getting very specific with this common phrase that often doesn't mean anything, but at StoryGrid, we have a really specific thing we're doing with the narrative device. So the way we look at a story is that there is an author, so someone who is capable of and wants to tell a story to shed light on Sam's problem. We have Sam, the single audience member. This is someone who faces a problem similar to the protagonist. And then we have what we call the double factor problem. And for now, just understand the double factor problem is a problem which does not have a clear this or that answer. It depends on the context and involves important trade-offs, right? So these aren't problems, these aren't simple problems like how do I get to the grocery store and there's one way to do it. It's complex problems. It's problems that have complex answers. And so the best way to help walk somebody through an answer is to tell them a story. And so the single audience member, so you as the reader of the story, when you're reading a story, you're putting yourself in the protagonist's shoes and you're learning alongside them as they go through solving their problems. And so when we're thinking about a narrative device, we want to get really, really clear on who our Sam is, who the person is telling the story, and the double factor problem. So let's get really, really clear. Let's look at The Hobbit again. So first of all, the author is, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien. But it's not just J.R.R. Tolkien, because J.R.R. Tolkien is lots of different things. He fought in a war, he was an author, he was a friend, he has done a lot of different things. And so when we think about the author, we think about, well, what version of you is telling this story, right? Because we always show up in our lives as different people. We're a different person at work than we are with our spouse, than we are with our kids, than we are with our friends, right? And so when we think about The Hobbit, it's actually it's not just J.R.R. Tolkien, it's J.R.R. Tolkien, the grandfather. It's like a grandfather telling a story to his grandchildren. This is actually how he came up with The Hobbit, was by telling his grandchildren stories. And so the author is J.R.R. Tolkien, the grandfather, and he's telling a story to Sam. The single audience member is his grandchildren. Now think about how that's going to shape how he tells the story. It's going to shape the kind of language he uses. It's going to shape how scary the story is. It's going to shape how he does the description. And again, think about this in your own life. Let's say you were telling a story about something that happened at work, and it was a really intense story, and you were telling the story to your spouse. You'd probably tell them the story with certain types of language, certain types of highlighted things that happen. You would downplay some things, upplay some things. Now, what if you told that same story to your 9-year-old niece, right? How would you tell her that story? Would you use the same language or would you use different language? You'd probably use simpler language. You probably wouldn't curse. You'd probably dumb some things down so she could understand them that you could tell to your spouse that wouldn't be that hard. And you might even tell the story completely different if you say, tell your priest about it, right? Again, different language, different things are more important. You describe things differently. So getting really clear on who you are telling the story and then who you're telling the story to makes it really helpful to understand how you're going to tell the story, the words you're going to use, and how you're going to highlight certain things and downplay other things. And then, of course, we come to the double factor problem. And when we look at the double factor problem, when we look at what Bilbo is dealing with in The Hobbit, you could say it's something like, when do you choose to stay at home and be secure? And when do you leave and go on a dangerous adventure? We all deal with this problem, right? When do you stay home and stay secure in something you know? And when is it time to strike out on an adventure that could be dangerous, but could be amazing at the same time? And if you think about J.R.R. Tolkien telling a story like this to his grandchildren, think about them, their children, entering this big, scary world, and they're going to have to start making decisions about when they stay safe and when they go on adventures. And a story like The Hobbit will help them know how to make those decisions. And so when we're looking at the narrative device, if we really want our reader to connect with our story, we have to get really clear about who is telling the story, what version of me is the author is telling the story, what single audience member am I telling the story to, and what problem am I helping that audience member with? And it's going to be the same problem that your protagonist is dealing with too, right? So this is how you, again, get your reader to connect with the writing and connect with your protagonist. All right, so far we've gone over how to get your readers to care about the protagonist, how to get your reader to connect with the writing, and then let's look at this final one, how to keep your reader engaged. So we need to know how to edit our book, right? There's this old, I forgot where I heard the advice, but it's like, well, how do you edit a book? It's easy. You just cut out the boring parts. But of course, if you've ever tried to do that, it's not that easy. So how do we know what to keep in our book and what to keep out of the book? This all comes back to this idea of a double factor problem. We're helping our protagonist and our Sam with the double factor problem. And in the case of The Hobbit, it's when do you choose to stay at home and stay secure, and when do you choose to go out on an adventure and leave the safety of home? So now, as you're writing, you want every word of your story to be helping your Sam make that decision, to understand how to make that decision. And what we call this at StoryGrid is relevance filtering, right? This is the tool that we use for this because everyone in the context is dealing with the same double factor problem space. And so what that means is everybody in your story is dealing with when to leave home on an adventure and when to stay home and be secure. And so everything that goes in the book has to be addressing that problem. The characters you choose, the description, the setting, how you tell the story, the words that you use, the verbs that you use, the kind of language you use, when to step in and speak directly to the reader and when to let the character speak. All of this has to be going towards that double factor problem. All of it has to be looking at how are we helping our Sam make a good decision in her life. So everything goes into that. And so this starts making it way easier to know what to write in your book. And I've noticed this myself. I'm currently writing my next novel right now, and it's this one thing has really, really helped my writing because as I'm writing, I'm thinking, okay, everything has to be helping my reader with this decision. So if it's not helping them with that, I'm going to cut it out. So this is relevance filtering, and this is really important. I know this is kind of a heady idea, but what I want you to see is this is how you keep your book from being boring, is that you cut out the things that aren't helping your reader with their problem and helping the protagonist with the problem. And that's called relevance filtering. Okay, so that was a lot really quick, but I just want to get you to see how this stuff is working. So we are helping our reader connect to the protagonist by making sure the protagonist is the one outputting, that they're the one reacting to things happening. We make sure our reader is connecting with our protagonist by being really clear on who is telling the story, the single audience member they're telling the story to, and the problem they're helping that audience member with, because that's going to be the same problem as our protagonist. And we keep our readers engaged. We keep them from getting bored by making sure every single line of everything we write is helping our reader with that problem. And so again, this is just 3 of the tools we use here at StoryGrid to make sure that your line-by-line writing is compelling and exciting. And this has made a huge progress in not just my writing, but our students' writing. And we've seen so much progress in the writing just by focusing on these 3 things. This is how you keep readers reading. So again, I want to go all the way back to the beginning, because in that first lesson, we talked about what is StoryGrid, and we talked about what our method is, and how we study masterworks to find the patterns in these great stories. We develop different ways of studying the masterworks so we can understand them, and you've seen a handful of these already. We looked at genre at this big macro level. What is our whole story about? And then we looked at looking at stories through this 5 commandments of storytelling. And then you can go all the way down and look at each line of writing through this idea of input and output and relevance filtering and narrative device. And you can study masterworks this way. And then we look at how masterworks have done that. And we compare these masterworks to our own writing to see the differences. And then we can fix the differences. This is how we locate what's wrong with our writing so that we can fix it. And so we've covered a lot, right? We covered that story is all about change, how that change affects our genre and the values at stake in our story. We looked at those values, at that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and those fundamental human values that we all share, that every story is about. And then we looked at how to ensure that change is happening in your story by looking at those 5 commandments: the inciting incident, turning point, progressive complication, crisis, climax, and resolution. And then we got all the way down to that sentence level, that beat by beat level, and we looked at input output and how the protagonist has to constantly be the outputter. We looked at our narrative device of the author, Sam, and double factor problem. And then we looked at the relevance filter and how to know what should go in your story and what shouldn't go in your story. So this is just 7 things. Now, here's some things we didn't cover that are also a part of StoryGrid. The 5 genre leaves. We didn't go deep into each of those genre leaves and how they affect your storytelling. Individual content genres. We can dive deep into the love genre, the action genre, the worldview genre, the society genre, and one of the 12 different genres. And inside of those genres, we have conventions and obligatory moments that make sure that we're satisfying our readers' expectations for our story so that it will be a story that they love. We didn't look at the 4 core framework. We didn't look at point of view and how that affects your story and how it's a lot bigger choice than just first, second, or third point of view. There's a lot that goes into getting your point of view right. There's a narrative path, which is how to actually plan out your entire story, to plot out your story from beginning to end. There are heroic journey archetypes that must be in every story that you tell. The foolscap, how you can plan out your entire story on just 1 page. The StoryGrid spreadsheet, how you can look at 13 different elements of every single scene to make sure they're working on that scene by scene level, and a whole lot more. StoryGrid is so much deeper and so much more expansive and helpful than what we went over in these 3 lessons. And so I really want to invite you to keep digging in. I want you to go deeper into StoryGrid, and we've got lots of great resources for you. So right now, if you just go to storygrid.com, we've got dozens of free articles to help you dig into this. We have individual articles on all the genres, on conventions, obligatory moments, point of view, all kinds of different things, so you can keep going with what you've learned in this training. We also have lots of books available. So if you go to storygrid.com/books, we have lots of books available to help you with your craft that go deep dives into a lot of these lessons for great storytelling. If you need help finding editing, you can go to storygrid.com, click on editing. We have dozens of great certified editors that can help you with your story. If you're not sure who to hire, there's a form there you can fill out and we'll connect you with an editor that's perfect for you. So if you want to work alongside an editor that deeply understands StoryGrid, this is a great way to get help with your story. And we have trainings as well. We have all kinds of trainings to help you plan out your story, help you understand genre, and help you with your scene writing. And those are available at the website as well. I really hope you've enjoyed these lessons and gotten this introduction to StoryGrid so you can see how it can help you structure and tell a great story. We want you to write a story that readers will love and tell their friends about. And that's why we exist at StoryGrid. And so I hope you got a lot out of this. I hope you had a good time, and I hope you go to storygrid.com and dig even deeper into what we have available. I really appreciate you being here again. I am Tim Grahl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid. I want to thank you for being here on behalf of Sean Coyne, our creator and founder as well. Thanks so much for the work you do as a storyteller, and I will see you soon in the StoryGrid universe. Bye for now.